December. And we'll meet through the last Monday before the 20th, and then kind of pick up again after, unless people feel like if we did this online, that would make sense to do during the break period on the 23rd and on the 30th, but we can kind of gauge that over time. You guys can let me know what you think, inshallah. So on this hadith, we've been looking at it kind of in the prism of one of the primary objectives of shari'ah, which is the preservation of life. And the sanctity of life we talked about in deep detail some weeks ago. What does Islam have to say about this as a universal ethic? The sanctity of all life, not just Muslim life, but in addition to Muslim life, just human life more broadly speaking. We talked about the maqasid sharia, the objectives of Islamic law, and looked a little bit into what's the point of sharia in the first place. And the idea is that it's not a system that operates in a vacuum, but its implementation is meant to increase benefit and reduce detriment. We talked about what kind of becomes a basis for the derivation of legal rulings, more generally speaking. And then we've been looking at an article that was written on the Yaqeen Institute website that was entitled Stoning and Hand Cutting, Understanding the Hudud and the Sharia in Islam, just to be able to give us a different vantage point on how we approach this hadith. So we want to try to wrap up that article today as best as we can. And before we do that, if somebody can read the hadith, the Arabic, the English of it is hadith number 14, and then we'll jump right into the article itself. But who can read for us? You can read either the English or the Arabic. We want to read both. Guys, you know I'm going to ask you every week. Yeah, go ahead. Somebody read the English? Yeah, go ahead. Another frame we want to look at this in before we get into the article is not just also the aspects of physical harm alone within the prism of sanctity of life, right? If you look at the maqasid sharia, we tend to have 5 primary objectives that are associated with Islamic law. Does anybody remember those 5 objectives? Or any one of them? You do? Do you want to say it out loud? Okay, the preservation of family, lineage. What else? Preservation of life. Life, yeah. Property. Okay, property. And then I have religion and intellect, right? So you'd also have some people who would add to this a 6th bucket that is like dignity. Do you know honor, right? And when we're thinking about a hadith like this, that's a frame you want to be able to understand this also, that the inviolability of an individual is not limited just to kind of freedom from physical harms, but understanding that at a base level, dignity also exists in freedom of harms of all kinds, right? We have hadith that tell us, al-Muslimu man salim an-nas min lisanihi wa yadayhi, that the Muslim is the one that mankind is protected from their tongue and their hand, right? Like you're not meant to be somebody who debases individuals or creates pain or hardship for them in other ways, but the idea is that there's sanctity kind of across the board, inclusive of like preservation from physical dangers to one's life, but the overall sanctity of life is about a recognition of how, one, there's an absence of degradation of humanity, and two, just an overall sense of how you kind of elevate people because they're people. Do you know what I mean? And not in like a way that is unhealthy, but in a way that essentially just sees Muslims aren't supposed to hurt people. Do you know what I mean? Does that make sense? So we want to go through the remainder of this article. If people want to pull it up. If you do a search, if you don't have it, on yaqeen and hudud and stoning, right? It'll come up. But why we've been looking at this article rather than just having only discussion or kind of conversation on it is because you want to utilize an opportunity of looking at a text like this, like the Hadith, to be able to then extrapolate for us a sense of, well, what really goes into interpretation and taking meaning from something. So we're not reducing, nor are we in a place where we get caught off guard, but in building foundational literacy in our religion, we can start to take from articles like this a sense of how these things are approached more broadly, and give us a baseline understanding so we're not in a place where we feel like we have to defend anything, while simultaneously internalizing a sense of self-loathing that people who want to impose narrative upon us are looking to do as they construct fear in others by otherizing us, but also building a sense of self-loathing within us because we're trying to answer questions that we have access to information to help us be in a place of comfort with, but they take advantage of also a low literacy that makes us then that much more susceptible to seeing our Islam as a liability and not as an asset. And so I think we read through the section that was on the historical application of the hudud in Islamic civilization. And we also looked at the appendix, right? That kind of broke down what were the ambiguities that As-Subki, rahimahullah, said, like this was what he would look for if there was a case that presented itself in terms of theft, right? That would then remove the implementation of hand cutting. You see? Yeah. So why don't we pick up from the section that says, why have rules if you don't follow them? Law in pre-modern versus modern societies. People want to get to that part in the text. Right, and the default from this, from the paragraphs before, was that a hadith of the Prophet ﷺ that these jurists and these judges were utilizing was one that told them to err on the side of mercy rather than in conviction, right? That they were given the advice of warding off the hudud, that you're leaving those things behind as best as you can. And so this section of the article is rooted now in this sense of, well, there was a large gap in the implementation of these punishments. So now we're at a section that says, well, what's the point of having them if they weren't going to be put into practice to begin with? Does somebody want to read? When my students read about shari'ah? Yeah, go ahead.
When my students read about Sharia law, their first reaction after learning about the hudud is, why have the punishments you're not going to apply? This question strikes at the root of the incongruity between modern law and how many view the Sharia. Although it seems obvious, and indeed essential to many today, the notion that a legal system should function as a routine and ordered machine stripped of cultural fictions and traditions is fairly new. It is a product of legal reforms envisioned by modernists like the English philosopher and jurist Jeremy Bentham.
So in like Sharia, you have different things that are given considerations also. Like urf is something that people look at, like custom, do you know? And that's an important thing to understand, that somebody is aware of kind of the localized aspects of something and not speaking in a vacuum. uh, I went to Sri Lanka. I don't know if any of you are Sri Lankan. Is anybody here Sri Lankan? I can't see all the way over there. No? There's no Sri Lankans in the room? What? Are you kidding me? Yeah, it's crazy. Has anybody ever been to Sri Lanka before? No? Does anybody know what Sri Lanka is? Yeah? Good. At least we have, great. So when I went to Sri Lanka, one of the first things somebody asked me in a public lecture I was giving was, is it permissible to eat gold? Do you know? And I didn't understand why this question was being asked. And then I did an interview with a journalist in Sri Lanka, and we were talking about a lot of different things. And as the questions were coming, whenever I'd give an answer, the guy would start shaking his head at me. And after 3 or 4 questions where he just kept shaking his head at me, I was like, am I saying something wrong that you keep shaking your head at me? And he was like, I'm not shaking my head at you, as he shook his head at me, you know? And a couple minutes later, I was like, when you agree with somebody, do you shake your head? And he said, yes. And I said, oh, where I come from, when you agree with someone, we nod our heads up and down. When we disagree, we shake our heads, right? But I didn't have a baseline understanding, because I'm not Sri Lankan, from Sri Lanka. Do you know what I mean? And the understanding also of how certain things functioned in various norms, right? One of the talks I gave was to a gathering that was just at a women's school. And I don't know if you guys have ever gone to Islamic lectures in other parts of the world, but it's great. I walked into this room and there was a poster on the wall, and my face was the size of half of this building on this poster. And the whole time I'm looking at myself in this giant format. But when they started the program, 2 young women came and started with a Quran recitation. And I might have just my own stereotypes of understanding what I thought I would experience kind of abroad. But it wasn't even an issue for them, right? Whereas you could go to parts of Pakistan or India or whatever else, and they wouldn't have women reciting publicly in front of a mixed gender audience, but it wasn't something that was a problem for them, right? And there's other places that this happens too, but in understanding some of what we bring into this is local custom is understood, right? Culture is understood. It's not a homogenized system that's reduced in such a way where individualism removes from us our identities. You don't commit cultural apostasy when you become Muslim. There's other considerations given, right? Let's continue. Sorry, Nirvana. Go ahead.
Prior to the comprehensive legal reforms in American and British law from the mid-19th century to the mid-20th, having laws on the books that were not intended to be applied was normal. In fact, it's still a feature of law today in the U.S. How many times do we see signs warning us that littering will be punished by a maximum fine of $1,000? How many of us know anyone who has been fined $1,000 for littering? How many college students are allowed to drink under the age of 21? To quote the conservative legal scholar Robert George, and also Paul of Tarsus, law is our teacher. It is not just a means of resolving disputes or maintaining order. It is a statement by authoritative voices within a society of how that society should be. Another major historical change was in law enforcement. Modern law enforcement, as we know it, emerged in Great Britain in the early 19th century. It is no coincidence that Britain was also the first state to transition into a new stage of human history, comparable in its dramatic changes to humans settling down in agricultural communities 5 millennia prior, that of a modern industrialized society. This involved changes in every area of human life, from culture and religion to political representation and economic power.
Yeah, so in thinking out these 2 things now, right? In the preceding paragraph, Dr. Brown is giving us an insight that these are normative practices in many societies, that you would have things on the book that aren't necessarily implemented, but they're meant to be deterrents. Do you know what I mean? And where and how those deterrents play a role in creating social order and impacting behavior, but the likelihood that somebody is going to get penalized for something. Like in New York City, in most of the world, you're supposed to cross at the crosswalks, not in the middle of the street. I don't know how any of you walk in the street in New York, but I walk in the middle of the street all the time. And my wife gets very upset with me. My children call it, like, instead of jaywalking, they call it Baba walking. Um, and, uh, you know, like, you don't get a ticket for it necessarily. Do you see what I mean? It's not like a good thing to do. You shouldn't do it. But in understanding how some of those things function and why they function. But what we also want to understand from a paragraph like this, the legitimacy of how it's done in Sharia is not rooted in finding a comparable component in another legal system. Do you get what I mean? Like, we don't have to say how we do it is acceptable because somebody else also does it in the same way. So that's not what he's doing here. He's not saying this is okay because it relates to something else. Like doing the dhibha of meat in Sharia, like having halal meat and slaughtering practices, is not a valid thing just because kosher exists. You know, you can utilize kosher as a way to give a comparison to somebody that says we have this similar to it, but the normalcy of it is not meant to exist for us to feel comfortable with it just because somebody else does it. Do you see what I'm saying? Does that make sense? Right? Like, a lot of people are very happy when someone takes their shahada. Do you know? And you guys see people take their shahada in our community all the time, right? And there's a genuine care and there's a certain affection. But some of us also feel happy when somebody from a different ethnic or racial background is becoming Muslim because it validates for us a connection to our faith in a way that isn't necessarily inward out, but we start to see resonance with our tradition because somebody from a different cultural background or social background is also becoming Muslim, as if that's something that we need for our Islam to be valid. Do you get what I mean? And that's not what he's doing here, right? He's not saying that, well, like, this is okay because there's littering laws that no one is, like, also honoring and it exists elsewhere. So we're not the only, like, people who do this, because there's a lot of stuff that we are the only ones that do, right? And that's something you just have to be comfortable with. Do you know? And it becomes purposeful in supremacist systems to seek validation from what the norm is without ever being able to become the norm. Do you know what I mean? So you always have to, like, explain yourself and why you do things the way you do them. And there's some people who never have to explain themselves. Do you know? And I go to whatever, like, wit's end to compensate on behavior and practice to be able to get the approval of who exactly. Do you see what I mean? But here we're looking at this through the idea of, like, what's the purpose of certain legal structures and vehicles? Do you see what I mean? And to get to a place where comprehension can be understood or ascertained with a little bit more ease by making it comparable to an example that we have access to, and not necessarily saying Islam is good because these guys also don't charge you when you litter on the ground. Do you see the difference in the two things? Does that make sense? Okay. And as he goes through this now in terms of legislative development and giving an understanding of tools that are now put into play that didn't necessarily exist prior to certain eras historically, like, the implementation of law enforcement becomes important, especially for us to understand this within the context of where we live today. Because if you have control over state-sanctioned law enforcement, you have control over military, you have control over a lot of stuff. And it's a huge bucket of power within dynamics of power, right? You have control over wealth, you have control over the flow of information, you have control over numbers, like you have access to a lot of numbers, right? You have control over law enforcement. Like, we can talk about buckets of power in a lot of different ways. Power is not just like I am the model minority that has made a certain amount of money and I have a certain degree and a house and I made it, because you're going to get surveilled just like the person who doesn't have those things, and you should be comfortable with that. I don't know how many people came to Jummah on Friday at the IC, where I was talking about like the Prophet ﷺ's marriage to Khadija radiallahu ta'ala anha. Were any of you here for that? Yeah. So one of the things that I said, like, we're in this month, Jumada al-Awwal, and the biographers of the Prophet's life, many would say that the Prophet and Khadija got married in this month. And he does not have as much money as she does. She is substantially wealthier, as well as, much older, 15 years older. You don't want to use that in a way that is like cliche, but just understanding objectively, what does the root of the mindset come from that says like the man has to be older and the woman can't be more educated, more degrees, or more wealth? It's not an Islamic concept. If anything, it's a concept that's a remnant of colonization. Because who are the people that wanted this notion to be what it was? That the man has to be X, Y, or Z, and the woman has to be X, Y, or Z. As if like that is the norm and nothing else is acceptable. And you can't like see it any other way. Because the Prophet was somebody who didn't have as much wealth as Khadija, and he was younger than her. Do you know what I mean? So where does the transition come in? And how do we understand that also in lieu of certain things like this in the implementations of what we've been exposed to and the development of law enforcement in this way, especially as an ongoing tool of the implementation of inequitous practice, becomes something that we just start to think of as the norm, as rather than thinking of like, well, what are the structures that actually put these things into play? Do you see what I mean? Right? Let's continue. Nirvana, do you want to keep going?
Pre-modern states like France or Britain, not to mention massive multinational empires, were highly decentralized. Often, the rulers had little direct control outside major urban areas and sometimes only around the capital. What technologies like the railway, Britain was joined by railways in 1851, followed by the US, and the telegraph, in regular use by the 1850s, enabled states to do what was actually project their authority among their populations on a scale never possible before. At the same time, improvements in healthcare and sanitation meant that for the first time, the population of a city like London actually grew on its own without depending on immigrants. Previously, morbidity in European cities was so high that there were death traps with higher death and birth rates. By 1850, more than half the population of Britain lived in cities, a milestone reached globally around the year 2000. That meant the problems of crime in cities also saw many-fold increases.
Okay,
So,
keep
as far
going.
as law is concerned, what the modern, industrialized, urbanized state and society was meant for: 1. Was unprecedented challenges of law and order; 2. A new vision for an ordered, rational, technologized, and bureaucratized world; and 3. The technological, administrative, and financial resources to pursue this vision and tackle new challenges. It is difficult for us to imagine how law and order functioned prior to these mid-19th century developments. Prior to 1830, Britain had no organized police force. Through major cities like New York and Boston developed police forces by the 1840s. Only after the Civil War did official police forces become a normal feature of urban life in America. Ironically, formal police forces in the U.S. South developed out of slave patrols that had formed decades earlier to track the movement of slaves and free blacks out of fear of a rebellion. Of course, cities had not been lawless up to this point. As early as 1285, the British monarchs had instituted decrees to safeguard law and order in London, just as Louis, what number is that?
14th.
14, thank you, did in Paris. But these ad hoc, often unprofessional watchmen were only found in capital cities. More importantly, they did not engage in preventative policing, walking the beat. nor investigation of the wide ranges of crime reported. The same apply to the institution of the shita, or all meaning roughly police in Islamic civilization, which can first be found under the early caliphs. Prior to the 19th century, the only law enforcement officials in cities and towns around the world were the equivalents of local marshals or sheriffs, whose main job was to handle prisoners and provide security in the court. In Britain, if someone committed a serious crime, the assumption was that a great hue and cry would be emitted and that a crowd would bring the perpetrator to the courthouse to stand trial. Outside of Islamic metropolises like Cairo or Istanbul, where Sharia court was readily available to litigate people's disputes, people in rural areas probably settled most disputes informally within villages or family networks.
So do you get kind of the illustration in your head? Like when you live in a overly policed state, you know, when the norm is that there are like cops around you all the time, do you know? Like you can walk through New York City and you'd be surprised what is actually a camera. Like you don't even know what kind of things that are there that are cameras. And the presence of people in your lives, not in like conspiracy-esque ways, but every time you are utilizing like Apple Pay, every time you're utilizing a Metro card, every time you're using a credit card, like somebody knows exactly where you are. Do you know? And so the ability to be monitored, to be surveilled, you know, think about just the anxiety that exists in the last year, a fear of being doxxed, a fear of somebody like doing a deep dive into social media posts, a fear of somebody like being in a place where they are reading messages on insecure networks. You like something just by chance, and who's watching what. This was not the norm that existed. And if anything, it was grossly at the other end of the spectrum, meaning there weren't people in your business constantly, like in your face to see when you slip up or when you screw up. Do you know? When you have people whose patrol is purposely rooted in policies like stop and frisk, that they are willfully just stopping black and brown men because they're black and brown. Do you know what I mean? Just to see, is there something happening that shouldn't be happening? The default is one of suspicion, right? I can't get on a plane to do humanitarian work without federal law enforcement officers like getting in my face. And then when I land, it's the same conversation. Do you see what I mean? Right? And you sometimes walk around and you see in New York City, like, why are there so many cops? And how are they doing all of the stuff that they're doing? They're just like there constantly, right? What he's saying is this isn't the norm. Do you know? You might have had in major settings individuals whose job was the enforcement of law, right? But take it to a concluding point that isn't visualizing how law enforcement happens here. Why would they not have that many people whose job it was to enforce law? Do you get what I mean? Like the tactic was not, let's go and monitor and be in people's business across communities. There's certain things that have to be able to maintain themselves between the person and Allah. And if something happened that was overtly egregious, the system in and of itself was built in a way where the local populations would come together and ensure that the sanctity of their social order wasn't violated. They'd like step up and do something about it. Do you see what I mean? Does that make sense? Okay. The rest of this, he's going to kind of go through similarly. Let's just read through all of it so we can read through all of it, right? Another part of us doing this is so that we read an entire article together. Do you know? You want to have the patience to read every word on a page in a book. Like not just skim through it or like lose patience and jump from one place to another, but to go through the exercise of being able to complete something in its entirety. So it's not just like soundbite attention spans that we have. Do you know what I mean? The website didn't load in 4 seconds. I just got to go to another website. Do you know? But you go through it and you kind of take from it as much as you can. Do you want to keep reading? Go ahead.
Commercials and sheriffs conjure up images of the Wild West, and this is actually helpful, as in films like High Noon or Tombstone, marshals and pre-modern crowns were on their own. Only in exceptional situations could they call on and deputize private citizens for
A posse.
Yeah. Films like The Wild Bunch and Butch Cassidy and The Sundance Kid, in which tough and endearing groups of outlaws are eventually mowed down mercilessly by the sheer order force of the modern state. Commemorate the losses and gains felt at moving from the self-help and community of the pre-modern to the regimented and impersonal world of the modern. Simply put, pre-modern states did not have the means to engage in the type of law enforcement that we consider normal today, particularly preventative policing and the investigation of mundane crimes. This important fact lies behind the severity of punishment found in Islamic law and in many pre-modern legal systems for that matter. Though scholars of criminal law continue to disagree on the best means of deterring crime, the common approach has been a utilitarian one formalized by Bentham. Its basic premise is the following equation. Expected punishment divided by deterrent power equals, in brackets, S, severity of punishment, X, in brackets, probability of getting caught, E equals X times P, so severity times punishment.
Okay, so think about this formula in relation to the hadith that we're reading. Do you see? Right? The deterring mechanism is rooted in what exactly? And how is it that they're influencing like social norms and social behaviors that create now a preventative mode of let's not do these things while simultaneously like building and establishing a mode of just cohesiveness in society that allowed for people to live as best as they could in healthy ways. Do you see what I mean? Right? So the expected punishment is what? Like, these are 3 instances. If you do these things, you might be liable to also being like in a capital punishment situation. Do you see what I mean? And the severity of this in and of itself multiplied by the probability of getting caught, right? And now that variable is like very low, do you know? So it's not like 10x by 10x, but it's 10x by like 0.1x. You need 4 male witnesses to witness the actual act taking place for the married person who's committing adultery to have like the HUD punishment carried against them. Do you see what I mean? Does that make sense? Okay, let's keep going.
In a system where there are few or no police, or where the police do not busy themselves in investigating crimes, moderately intelligent criminals face little chance of being caught. According to the E equals S times P equation, if the probability, P, of being caught is minuscule, then in order for any meaningful deterrent effect to be created, the severity of punishment S must be met. Frightening punishments were seen as the only way to deter potential crimes whose police, what few there were, would never be able to reach. We can see this clearly in Britain in the 1700s and early 1800s. In 1820, there were over 200 crimes punishable by death in Britain, including stealing firewood and poaching fish from another's fish pond. The colony of Virginia had the death penalty for taking vegetables or fruits from a garden. But, similar to the Hadith, few people convicted of these offenses were actually executed. Putting thousands of petty offenders to death was not the intention of the law in Britain or its colonies. Scaring people into not breaking the law was. Inevitably, judges and juries would find procedural loopholes to reduce the punishment, such as purposely undervaluing stolen goods to drop the crime from a grand larceny, punishable by death, to petty larceny, punishable by flogging. And we can see how the mind-boggling advances in technology and administrative capacity in the mid-1800s changed Britain's legal landscape. More effective policing, better prisons, and, more importantly, better municipal services and a much advanced economy meant that more offenders were caught and convicted. P went up dramatically, so S dropped accordingly. By 1900, Britain had only 4 death penalty offenses.
Okay. So we're in a place where, like, he's kind of giving insight. Why are these things in place if they're not going to be executed or implemented upon? And the answer, in large part, is that they're meant to be a deterring variable. You know, that you need to be able to maintain some sense. In Sharia, the idea is also that this goes back now not to like a human endeavor, but what's pleasing to Allah. Do you see? And the idea of not getting caught in a worldly sense and understanding the recognition of accountability as being a 10x variable in relation to a minuscule probability of being caught is also not just the law enforcement person, but how it is that like the divine sees and witnesses all of these things. Do you know? So it's got to be a pretty serious offense in the eyes of Allah that the punishment is so severe. Do you see what I mean? Yeah. Waalaikum salam.
I come from a British country, and up to 2008, we used to condemn people, cutting off their heads for a severe punishment. That was a death penalty. It's called condemning in Jamaica until 2008, and then just stopped it in 2008. But that's what criminals used to get. They cut off their heads in the public ceremony.
Yeah, I mean, here too, right? They just killed Khalifa Williams in an execution, do you know? And if we got into this more in detail, uh, people are like, I, how is it possible that you're able to just watch so many people die and get killed? I mean, we live in a country where people used to gather as a public event to watch public lynchings. Do you see what I mean? So the nuances of like how we can understand this in terms of its applicability to people of various minority backgrounds is going to also vary from place to place. In a Sharia-based system, the idea is that those are not variables that are put into consideration, right? So when the Prophet ﷺ is saying to people who are saying, like, you cannot do this to so and so, a woman named Fatima, because of her lineage, etc., who made a transgression, he says, and I mentioned this last time, that even if Fatima bint Muhammad had done this, like, we would ensure that it's carried out against her. Do you know what I mean? Like, that ideal is not there because everybody theoretically in a Sharia based system understands accountability is going to be to the divine. Do you know? And we're going to talk about this. I think he's going to get into it a little bit more in the remaining sections on like how people understand rehabilitation to actually function, and what the role of capital punishments is within that, in certain ways. But you got to also understand just how like deeply racialized law enforcement is and how deeply inequitous it is like in the world that we live in, not just in this part of the country. Do you know what I mean? Okay. Let's take just a couple of quick minutes. We turn to the persons next to us. What are we taking away so far? What's coming up for people in relation to like the hadith? Just the article in a vacuum, but the perspective in relation to the hadith, like what is it bringing up for us? The last few weeks we've been discussing this, and we'll come back and talk about it for a bit. But go ahead.
Yeah, exactly. Or like maybe the four witnesses example is like, right? That's still like that's as difficult today. Like implemented and like carried out under like an Islamic government. But like if based on what we're hearing, the Islamic government's influence would also necessarily within your city. And like in these smaller towns, if you don't have the establishment of Sharia fully based on the Islamic government, and they're more so just like more concept, like you see them in Pakistan, where you have like Sharia system, or like Punjab, these like local groups that keep carrying out these Sharia punishments under a non-Sharia government. So like how does that like what level of government needs to be established for right? Like does it need to be that rule? Like can just a local town like look at it? I think that's sort of like what's coming up for me based on the right. You just can't have like you have to like rebuild sort of like your understanding of what a society or government or state looks like from an Islamic perspective.
Okay, what are some of the things that are coming up for people so far? What are we taking away? I don't think we're gonna get through the whole article today, the rest of it. I don't think so. What are some of the things that are coming up for people so far? What did we discuss? What do you got there? What is it? Jelly beans? What? I'm okay. Any thoughts so far? What did we discuss? Maybe we get one or two people and then we'll continue.
No, we were just discussing on how, like, these ideas are like so different from the time that they were like said and like spoken about. Like so, for example, like for the hudud punishment to be carried out, you need an establishment of Islamic government. But like in our today's mind, what does that Islamic government look like? Is that like can the city of New York say, hey, we're going to an Islamic government model, so therefore we can implement Sharia in New York, or does it need to be like a federal thing. So similar to like that thought came up sort of because, as we were mentioning, the the influence of the state was in the bigger cities, and a lot of the magistrates were sitting and implementing these hudud punishments in bigger cities. Whereas in the outer towns or in the rural areas, you don't have, you know, the influence of the Islamic government necessarily, and you have these local jirgas or like local communities that are making these and carrying out these punishments based on their understanding of Islam, which is still happening to this day. So like, how does that connect to like implementation of law enforcement at a local level? Whether you can say, hey, if you have a community of 500 people and they all decide we're going to implement Sharia law, does that constitute as an Islamic government? And then you can carry out hudud punishments.
Yeah, so those local villages should not be doing it, right? Is the idea, especially if what their implementation is contrary to the prevailing kind of nation state that they're a part of. You know, Allah knows best. Do you know what I mean? But also, this is where you see a challenge, like in the last like century of Islam versus the first 13 centuries, the implementation of had punishments, because of reasons like what you're saying, is substantially higher than what it was in the entirety of like Islam's experience. Do you know? But that's the whole idea, right? Like it's not just a I think, I want, I feel type thing. Like there's processes in play, do you know? And it's not meant to be like reduced in the way that it's reduced. This is the whole idea, right? Like there's a certain mercy that comes from this not being something that's so easily kind of, you know, witnessable. Do you see what I mean? Right? Certain things could be, but like others are not. Do you know? But it takes like a turn because it becomes absent of like some of these ethical principles that guide it. You know. The cruel and unusual punishment section. Let's try to get through as much of that as we can, but I don't want us to. I know I say it every time, but I'm gonna try like really hard to not stop like an hour from now. So let's try to like read through this and kind of get through as much of it as we can. Does anybody want to read the next session? No discussion of criminal law in the Sharia. You want to read more? Go ahead, yeah. You get a star for today.
Okay, so cruel and unusual punishment. No discussion of criminal law in the Sharia can pass without addressing the issue of Western revulsion at flogging, the most prominent form of punishment historically employed by Muslim courts, and at the dramatic hudud punishment of amputation and stoning. Today we think of incarceration as the normal way of punishing crime, so much so that it becomes difficult to conceive of a moment when prisoners were not at the core of criminal justice. To quote one noted scholar, but prisons have been the exception, not the rule, for punishments in human history. They are immensely costly, especially for the perennially, cash-strapped pre-modern state, and carry within them constant worries over security. Prior to the 17th century, when the situation in Europe changed, the main use of prisons globally had been for detaining suspects pending and during trial, not for punishment.
Right, so this is like why you want to understand history and how the prison industrial complex in the United States is a remanifesting of slavery with Jim Crow in the middle, and why prisons are corporatized and they're private prisons. So people are making a lot of money off of the prison system in a variety of ways, and that's something that becomes in a socializing kind of mode, the norm, or understanding this to be the norm, is purposeful, that this must be like the only or the best way of doing this, when in reality, they just figured out a way to monetize it. And they don't care about black people. And so the only thing that has to be created is this prison pipeline that is constantly disrupting like the lives of so many people. And that's like the point of the system. And what did we say was the point of Sharia? Increasing benefit and reducing detriment, right? What is the point of institutions here? The preservation of whiteness and anti-blackness. That's just nothing other than objective fact, do you know? And to get to a place where you have to understand the system you're in while you also understand how it influences like the implementation of a system that's different from it. Do you know what I mean? And he's like prefacing this in this way because he's going to say these guys had no problem with killing people and executing them, but they have a problem with somebody taking lashes. Do you know? Like they think it's noble and good conduct to kill a prisoner and execute them, but there's like a sense that it's barbaric to like do something else that's much lesser than taking somebody's life. Do you see what I mean? Um, and you just want to think like what creates norms for us, you know? How do we understand something to be like good or bad or ethical? Do you see what I mean? And in our religion, like there's not a moral relativism. Allah and Allah's messengers say something's good, then that's what makes it good. Do you know? Um, okay, let's continue.
Corporal punishment, on the other hand, is quick and cheap. Although many condemn it as barbaric today, inflicting some form of pain on the body of the perpetrator has been the main means of punishing serious wrongdoing in human society. In Europe, from the Middle Ages through the 1700s, horrendous types of of mutilation were standard punishment. Amputating hands, fingers, ears, tongues, burning with hot tongs, drawing, and quartering. Thomas Jefferson recommended cutting a half-inch hole in the nose of women who engaged in sodomy. To understand how the situation changed, one must appreciate important trends in criminal punishment that accompanied industrialization in the early modern and modern West. In the 18th century, in Western Europe and later Britain, the dominance of execution and severe corporal punishment made way for various forms of forced labor, imprisonment, and deportation to the colonies. Although the first modern prison opened near Philadelphia in 1790, philosophy behind it had been maturing for decades. Growing out of institutions for forced labor in the 17th century, particularly in continental Europe, prisons emerged as institutions that combined incarceration and forced labor by those who had committed crimes that would otherwise have been punished by death. In the Quaker colony of Pennsylvania, thinkers like the founding father Benjamin Rush began articulating a theory of reformative justice in which harsh corporal or capital punishment would be set aside in favor of purifying the convict's soul in hopes of eventual redemption. Hence the origin of the American penitentiary, where prisoners are divided into their own small cells and given meager rations for the purpose of focusing them on reflection and consulting the Bible. This model, even after its secularization and allowance for more socialization, has since been exported widely. This historical arc seems comprehensible enough. Corporal punishment to prisons, brutal medieval mutilation makes for more sanitary executions, makes way for forced labor in prisons, which in turn makes way for the modern penitentiary, where criminals are reformed. But the reality is hardly so simple. Rather than progress from brutality to enlightenment, Western criminal sanctions have simply expressed new and highly idiosyncratic cultural understandings of what is and what isn't cruel and unusual punishment. America abandoned public corporal punishment for the penitentiary and reforming the convict by properly directing his soul. But the guiding was done by stunningly brutal means, more reminiscent of Abu Ghraib than a place of worship. Through the mid-19th century, prisoners were flogged.
Does everybody remember what Abu Ghraib is, right? Like where they were essentially like detaining, torturing all these Muslim prisoners in like recent times, do you know? This wasn't something that kind of existed centuries ago. So what the American government was doing to like detainees, prisoners. There's all kinds of like images and things that you can find that are highly grotesque. But yeah, continue. Sorry.
Through the mid-19th century, prisoners were flogged relentlessly, gagged and stuffed into small lockers where they couldn't kneel or lie down, and have their faces flooded with freezing water. What seems to have been the most deadly of all treatments was forcing prisoners into extended periods of total isolation with enforced silence. All of this was somehow seen as more humane than previous, unenlightened methods of punishment such as placing people in stocks to be pelted by fruit.
Yeah, so the psychological ramifications, right? It moves now from kind of deterring variables that are rooted in the objectives that we're seeing, the preservation of life, the preservation of property, the preservation, etc., you know, to like what we see fundamentally as abusive systems that are purposeful in continuing to impact minority populations in the ways that they're doing these kinds of things to minority populations, the other enemies, etc. And you got to see like how these things play out. You know, they can't call a war on drugs a war on black people. They don't call a war on terror a war on Muslims. But that's what fundamentally these things are. And because there's not a sanctity of life, you can do all kinds of like torture even in modern day settings. And nobody bats an eye because they buy into a socialized norm that has them believe that because X individuals are putting this forward, it must be like the most humane way of doing it, do you know? Because under supremacist systems, like certain people don't ever have to explain themselves. The way they do it must always be the best. Do you see? Go ahead.
The same erroneous conflation of cultural convention with enlightened progress can be seen in British colonial rule in India. When the British East India Company took over the responsibility for administrating Sharia law in the areas of India it controlled in the late 1700s, British officials were exasperated and shocked. They were primarily frustrated at how hard it was to execute criminals under the Sharia. They considered it a barbarous construction, that the family of someone who had been murdered could accept compensation money from the murdered instead of insisting on his execution. British officials couldn't help seeing this as some sort of chaos.
So they were bothered and thought it was lacking civility that if somebody had engaged in something homicidal, that the assailant could be let off from execution if the family member of the one who was killed said, instead of like killing this person, we'll just take like a monetary compensation. And they said, like, how can you have, like, killing is the better thing to do. Do you know? Go ahead.
But what truly morally shocked British officials was the use of amputation as punishment, and they eventually outlawed it in 1834. Hence, we find the bizarre confusion expressed by one British woman over how a local Sikh ruler who rarely had criminals executed, but instead punished them with amputation, was somehow not considered cruel by his subjects. The amputation the British were referring to was mainly not hand cutting, but rather an Indian punishment of cutting off the nose at the most severe punishment. Ironically, the Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb had banned this as alien to the Sharia. British fetishization of corporal punishment alongside a cavalier attitude towards its capital elder sibling is beautifully captured in the ironic title of J. Fish's book on colonial law in India, Cheap Lies and Deer Rings.
So do you see why he's saying like this title in and of itself is indicative of like an irony? Do you know, like you're willing to kill the actual person, but you're standing up to say like don't engage in some form of kind of punishment that like causes some type of temporary pain or like an amputation. Do you know? And an understanding like where the visceral reactions come in is based off of what exactly? Do you know what I mean? Because you parallel this also to the idea that imprisonment forever is somehow more humanitarian than the execution of punishments that incorporate something like a lashing. Do you know? Do you get what I mean? Right? And he's trying to demonstrate like the hypocrisy as well as like just how does that make sense? Do you know? That you're arguing that we should kill this person rather than having there be some monetary compensation. Do you know? Or like you put someone like I don't know if you ever met people who have been in solitary confinement, let alone in prison. Do you know? Imagine like if all you had was a room that that's it. Like there's the toilet, there's walls, there's no window. You know, in New York City, you can't even call a room that someone sleeps in with no window a bedroom. You know, it needs to have a window for it to be legally called a bedroom. Do you know what I mean? And like we have members of our community, other than like their families going through mass deportations, like they have family members who are put in solitary confinement. Do you know? And they're in places where they are purposely made to have no sense of how much time has passed, how many days have passed. You know, my son likes watching Mr. Beast. I don't know if you guys have ever watched Mr. Beast, right? Do people know what Mr. Beast is, right? It's like most followed YouTuber, you know? Mr. Beast has like these experiments that he does or videos that he does where like either he or someone like one of his friends will like be in a room for multiple weeks or months at a time where they'll like bury themselves in like a container underground and then they'll ask the person how long do you think you've been here and they're like it must have been like a week and they've only been there for like 12 like for like 3 days, do you know, or 4 days. There's no like semblance of what's really going on around you, do you know? And it's not at random, it's just very purposeful. But the overarching sense is like we are people of consciousness and you are always somebody who's backwards. Do you know? It's good simply because this is the way that we do it and we deduce that this is how we do it and like how you say to do it doesn't make any sense. And that's why like local customs and the ta'zir like is understanding of what's happening locally as opposed to like a global sense of here's one person broadcasted across the entire like world because everybody doesn't know how everything functions day to day. And in our religion, we're not doing this because it's not like, Muhammad sallam and Allah are the ones who are determining like what is like right and wrong. Do you know? Not my like grandma said this or my dad said this or like this community said this. You know what I mean? And you see its implementation as problematic. Like when you walk around the streets, like who are the people that you see that are constantly like harassed by law enforcement, who are constantly being imprisoned, who are constantly like, harassed? And how many places do you go into? Like walk around your office space, walk around a classroom. How many white people do you see in comparison to people who are not white? How many people do you see are white and not black? How many people do you see are white and they're not like Native American? Like you can go through all of it and you can see like what the purpose is of the implementation of it. Do you see what I'm saying? Are you good to keep reading? Yeah, go ahead.
As U.S. law professor Peter Mastros recently pointed out in his book In Defense of Flogging, the notion that imprisoning someone in a cell is somehow more humane than subjecting them to brief but intense bodily pain is a collective cultural fiction, and it is totally belied by the reality of prison life in America. Even societies in which vicious corporal punishment was common, notes Mastros, rarely, if ever, placed a human being in a cell for punishment. Consequently, he concludes, That we accept prisons as normal is a historical oddity. An incarceration in the general population of a U.S. prison is mild treatment compared to placement in solitary confinement, a common practice in U.S. prisons. As 19th century American penitentiaries discovered, solitary confinement causes dramatic and often irreplaceable psychological damage. In 2011, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Torture concluded that just 15 days in solitary confinement constitutes torture or cruel, inhumane, or degrading treatment or punishment. And after that period, irreversible psychological damage can occur. The profound failings of the U.S. prison system further indict it as cruel and unusual form of punishment. First, prisons in the U.S. have totally failed to reform those sent there, which is not surprising considering convicts are placed not around positive role models, but around other criminals in an environment where 5% of prisoners say they've been sexually assaulted just within the previous year, and in which drug use is rampant. The result is the U.S. has by far the highest population of prisoners in the world and the second highest per capita.
So what he's saying is it doesn't even work. Do you know? Like it doesn't fundamentally work, right? And it's like rooted in lies, you know? Like we went to destroy weapons of mass destruction. No, like that's not what you did. Do you know what I mean? And you can't be blind to what realities are. But the elements that are there also don't actually give indication of understanding how human development works. Contrast it to the ways our religion and our texts implemented things like emancipation and prohibition. Do you know, the verses came down like there's good and bad in drinking, but the bad outweighs the good, right? Then a second verse, don't come to prayer in intoxication. And then a last verse that prohibits it outright. And with the spaces in between, they say that like the companions just went and streets were flooded with alcohol because they've been weaned in a process. The way prohibition is implemented in this country, not only do people not stop drinking, more people start drinking, they're doing it illegally by bootlegging, and it increases crime. There's not like a sense of how does the human function, do you know? Emancipation didn't happen forthright within Islam as a religion, but every single, pretty much, it's too absolute language, many like expiations for mistakes or inabilities to carry out certain practices was setting free a slave. And you had all over like the Muslim community people setting freed slaves because they kept messing up. Like they kept doing stuff they weren't supposed to be doing. Do you know? Here, like it didn't work. Like you still have slavery. Do you know what I mean? Right? Slavery, Jim Crow, prison industrial complex, right? It's all the same stuff, manifest in the same kind of ethos. Do you see what I mean? And this is like the thing. It just didn't stop. And you can't think about it in a vacuum. Like think about it in terms of everything we read. Umar radiallahu anh, he goes into the man's home and sees him doing things, and the man says, like, you found my one wrong by you doing 3 wrongs, right? Like he can't come into it. He can't violate his privacy. Do you see? And that's why you don't want to take information and understand it like just in isolation or in a vacuum. You want to be able to understand how it all can be looked at through the prism of new information. Do you get what I'm saying, right? And he is Amir al-Mu'mineen, like he's the Khalifa. And they're like telling him, like, no, I'm in my house. This is a private place. You cannot like come in here and tell me to do this stuff. You see what I'm saying? These guys want people to continue to engage in the infractions, and they want to have like thousands of law enforcement agents whose job is just to continue to feed people into like a prison system. Do you know? Go ahead. There's just a couple of paragraphs left in this section, then we'll take a pause here.
Second, U.S. prisons are cruel and unusual in that they destroy and atomize communities. As Anne-Marie Cusack points out, prior to the penitentiary movement, corporal punishment or humiliation was carried out in public, often in the town square. Criminals might not be publicly humiliated, but such public pain understands criminals as existing within that community. Prior to the mid-20th century, many prisoners were in the center of towns, and many prisons were in the center of towns, with prisoners still nearby their families. Now most prisons are in rural areas incredibly distant from the urban neighborhoods most disproportionately affected by incarceration. In America, even after release from prison, felons are denied the right to vote and are nearly unemployable. Around 5.3 million Americans who would have otherwise have a voice in their communities and country's political process are denied the vote due to a past felony. An American neurosis over criminal justice is even more evident in the application of the death penalty. Developed as a supposedly more humane alternative to hanging, the electric chair and lethal injection only euphemize the violence being done in the act of execution. As a U.S. federal judge observed in his decision regarding an execution in 2004, a society that carries out executions must acknowledge the brutality of the act and not try to disguise it by supposedly less violent means, which often fail to work as quickly and painlessly as they are supposed to.
Yeah. So understanding like kind of the qualitative aspects of some of these things, we're in a place where a subservience to Islam is rooted in this idea, like a God-centric notion is one that says like Allah knows best, do you know? And a part of that understands this, and you've heard me say this before, that God centricity means there's certain things that I'll enjoy doing. There's certain things that like I struggle with, and there's certain things I fundamentally just, I don't understand like why they are in the ways that they are. But it's not exerting a prism of understanding that's rational or irrational. It makes sense to me or does not make sense to me, but it interjects a third prism that is super irrational. I don't have to understand it in order for it to be true. These things are like the products of over-policing in what we see today. When we looked at the historical implementation of like the hudud, like 500 years in Ottomanist history like passed, and one record of a HUD punishment was implemented. Do you see what I mean? Does it mean that people weren't like committing adultery? Like probably not. Like that's what they said. They had to deal with the fact that certain things were taking place around the Muslim community, but it wasn't meeting this threshold, nor was it interjecting into the public domain in a certain way. Does that make sense? Versus like today, people are like, this is what stop and frisk is. When the NYPD has stop and frisk as a policy, they're just stopping black and brown people. That's all they're doing. They're stopping them because they're black and brown. That's the policy. Do you know? And it's not like dozens of people. You're talking about hundreds and thousands of people being stopped. Do you get what I mean? Under what premise? Just the color of their skin. And then if you take it on a micro level, right, the overt kind of policing, that happens in our communities too. I'm constantly in your face to be able to point out like, that's wrong, this is wrong, why do you do this, why do you do that, do you know? As opposed to like thinking about modes of empowerment and positivity, my default understanding is to see where is there something wrong, where there's a mistake, or there's a slip up in some way, right? As opposed to like what's inherently beautiful in somebody. Do you see what I mean? Does that make sense? Okay, let's do this really quick. If people want to take a quick minute, and let's just kind of talk out what's some of the things that are coming up for people as we kind of wrap up for today. And then next week, we'll kind of look at the particular categories in the Hadith. But just to give you an idea, right? Like this is, you know, a married person that's committing zina, a person who like kills another person, And a person who abandons religion with, like, in the prism of, like, committing treason. And we can talk about that in more detail, but there's numerous instances that were given indication that people, like, left Islam and there was no had punishment carried against them. But there was also an added element by many scholars that said once they did this and then they became, like, treasonous in their engagement of a government, right? But that's the framing of, like, some of these things that we're going to discuss next week. Let's, like, look at, let's just turn to the person next to us, talk out a little bit of what we're taking away from the two sections we read today, and then we'll come back and discuss. But go ahead. What's up?
I have a mic. What do you think is a good idea?
Yeah, let's do that right now. Are they here?
You know? Yeah, I'm gonna go pick them up.
Yeah, go. Sure.
This song gets put down.
Okay. Thanks, man. Are you sticking around? Are you gonna stick around?
Yeah.
Sure. Okay. What are some of the things we're taking away from today? Somebody's coming to take their shahada also, so people can stick around for that. But what are some of the things we're taking away from today's conversation? Maybe we can discuss for a few minutes. Nothing? What do we talk about?
Well, this is not what we spoke about, but what's coming to my mind was just how I've accepted the modern day form of punishment as like standard, as you know, any other alternative just doesn't make sense. And this did a good job pointing out the hypocrisy and like, yeah, our standard doesn't make sense actually. Like, how did we get to this point? You know?
Other thoughts? Yeah, and just, you know, as we're waiting for this person to come, it's a great conversation for them to enter into. Like, hey, it's first day as Muslim. Guess what we're talking about today? Like, it's not a joke, kind of punishing somebody for something. Do you know? So you want to think about that in terms of how you keep people accountable. Do you know what I mean? Like, I have children. I am not going to be devoid of an understanding of accountability in disciplining my kids, right? The Prophet's wife says, "Lam yadrib Rasulullahi imra'atan wala ghulaman wala waladan qat." The Messenger of God never struck a woman or a servant or a child ever, you know? like that's just the way the Prophet was. Do you see? And in understanding how there's a trickle down effect when we have like heightened systems of inequity that are rooted in like systems of doling out punishments, they're also done inequitably, right? Like if you see the way systems treat white people and black people differently, you see the way like in Muslim communities people are treated differently by like racial standards and standards of class. Do you know? Men are treated differently from women, like 100%. It's not even anything other than an objective fact. Like what people will let their boys get away with, they won't let their girls get away with the same things. Do you see what I'm saying? So you want to like extrapolate and distill in that regard. Also, how has it been like looking at this hadith through this article rather than just kind of like talking about it? Yeah.
I think that it provides important context in the way that like it highlights not only what we're dealing with right now, but also like historically the way that punishment has evolved, and it's not kind of like the word that you use, like you don't want to look at it in a vacuum, in the sense of the way that the repercussions have now derived from like very calculated history of the way that we see punishment.
Yeah. And when you think about this too, think about it not just in a worldly sense, but in otherworldly sense. You know, like when you look at now our tradition and it tells us things like Allah's mercy is outweighed his wrath. Do you know what I mean? And how these jurists are being advised, like err in mercy over erring in conviction. Do you get what I'm saying? It doesn't create indifference, but you just like understand that the implementers of this here are trying to represent like a lawmaker who is also going to be one we stand in front of, and we know him as Ar-Rahman and Ar-Rahim before we know him as anything else. Do you see what I'm saying? Okay, let's take a pause here. People want to clap for Nirvana, who read the entirety of this class. Inshallah. Yeah, great. So there's a brother who's going to take his Shahada. Is that correct? Yeah? So if people want to just kind of situate themselves for 2 minutes, I'm just going to talk to him really quickly, and then we'll get started.